The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of white snow and concussive sound. One moment I was pushing through the biting cold, focused on the mission, and the next, the German artillery found us. The snow kicked up in violent plumes, and a searing pain tore through my right arm, followed by a blunt, crippling impact to my knee. I stumbled, my body screaming in protest, but I kept moving forward. My instrument corporal was down, badly wounded in the leg, and I had sent the radio operator to drag him back to safety. Now it was just me, a single hand grenade, my only close quarters argument against a German machine gun nest. I had silenced them, a small victory in a battle that was rapidly turning against us. But as I pushed on through the knee-deep snow, the world grew strangely quiet. The shelling stopped, the rifle fire died away, and then I saw them. They materialized from the landscape of white and gray, spectral figures in long coats. First one, then three, then a dozen. All around me, a circle of black leather boots planted firmly in the snow, a forest of steel-barreled rifles pointed at my chest. The 11th Panzer Division had me. Exhausted, wounded, and utterly alone, I could only think of one thing to say, a simple plea in their own language, hoping it would be enough. Nicht schießen. Don't shoot. A young German soldier, his face barely touched by a razor, looked down at me with a weary expression, a look that spoke of too much fighting on too many fronts. His words were not a threat, but a statement of shared misery. Krieg ist kein Gutes. War is no good. In that moment, surrounded by the enemy, I could only agree. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had stood on the deck of the Queen Elizabeth, watching the gray shores of England recede as we steamed towards France. We had landed on Utah Beach about 4 weeks after the initial invasion, stepping onto a shore that had already been secured, but still bore the fresh scars of D-Day. The air itself felt different, heavier, charged with a tension that hadn't existed in the training camps of Mississippi. We were the 94th Infantry Division, and we were finally in the war. Our first major push was down through Brittany, a rolling countryside of hedgerows and ancient stone farmhouses that could hide an enemy squad as easily as a flock of sheep. My assignment was with a cannon company, a 4.2-inch mortar unit. As a platoon leader and forward observer, my place wasn't with the big guns in the rear, but at the very tip of the spear. I was 22 years old, and the constant danger felt less like a threat and more like a thrilling, high-stakes game. Every single night, I took my instrument corporal and my radio operator and slipped behind the German lines. It was our job to find the enemy, to pinpoint their positions so our mortars could rain destruction upon them. We moved like ghosts through the darkness, our faces blackened with cork, our senses alive to every snapped twig, every distant cough. I learned the rhythms of the night, the patterns of the German patrols, the geography of fear. We'd find a perch, a church steeple, the loft of an abandoned barn, a high point on a wooded ridge, and I would whisper coordinates into the radio handset, listening for the reassuring crump of our mortars finding their mark miles away. Then we would melt back into the shadows and return to our lines before dawn, our mission complete. It was exhilarating work, and in the heedless confidence of youth, I believed I was invincible. That belief was tested during a long patrol deep in enemy territory. We pushed too far, and the lines shifted behind us, cutting us off. For 2 weeks, we were stranded. It was then that we stumbled upon them, a battalion of the Free French of the Interior, a ragged but ferocious band of partisans operating from a hidden camp in the forest. Their commander was a man whose presence was as formidable as it was unsettling. His right hand was gone, severed by the Germans, and in its place was a crude steel hook. His eyes held a fire that burned with a hatred so pure, it was almost a physical force. These men lived by a different set of rules than we did. They took no prisoners, a fact the commander communicated with a grim finality. His war was one of survival and revenge, fought without quarter and without mercy. They accepted us into their fold, my 2 men and me. They showed me the best observation posts, the hidden trails, the secret ways of their war. They fed us from their stores of potatoes and the chickens they liberated from nearby farms. It was a strange, surreal existence. By day, we were soldiers hunting a common enemy. By night, the camp came alive with an almost defiant celebration of life. They had their girlfriends with them, women who were as tough and committed as the men, and every evening, after a meal of roasted chicken and boiled potatoes, they would gather around the fire. Their voices would rise in the defiant, soul-stirring anthem of La Marseillaise, and they would cry openly and without shame for their occupied homeland. It was a nightly ritual of passion and sorrow, and it moved me deeply. They insisted that we share our own anthem, and I found myself in the awkward position of having to teach my men the words to the Star-Spangled Banner, which they barely knew. We sang it every night, our voices a quiet counterpoint to their roaring chorus. Their brand of warfare was brutal and pragmatic. I witnessed their method for recruitment firsthand. They brought a captured German soldier into the camp, a young man trembling with fear. The one-handed commander asked him a single, simple question. Did he want to go to war with them? The German, confused and terrified, shook his head no. Without another word, one of the Frenchmen raised his rifle and the matter was settled. A short while later, another prisoner was brought in. He was older, a cook perhaps, with a weary face. When asked the same question, he hesitated, then gave a slight, resigned nod. Could he cook? Yes, he could. He was given a potato to peel and a place by the fire. He was one of them now. It was a stark and terrifying calculus, a lesson in the brutal realities of a partisan war. After 2 weeks, we found a seam in the German lines and slipped back through, rejoining our unit. The experience had changed me. The fun of the nightly patrols was now tempered with a sobering understanding of what was truly at stake. As winter deepened, our division was pulled from Brittany and sent north. The Germans had launched their massive counter-offensive in the Ardennes, and the Battle of the Bulge was raging. We weren't thrown into the Bulge itself, but became part of General Patton's Third Army, tasked with hitting the southern flank of the German advance. Our objective was to attack north, up the Moselle River. The intelligence reports told us we'd be facing the 416th Volksgrenadier, a unit comprised mostly of old men and boys, the bottom of Germany's manpower barrel. We thought it would be easy. We were wrong. In the days before our attack, the Germans had moved the 11th Panzer Division into the sector. We weren't facing old men. We were about to walk into the teeth of one of their most battle-hardened armored divisions, fresh from the Russian front. The attack began in the biting cold of January 1945. The ice along the Moselle was a foot thick, and the snow lay heavy on the hills. We hit a small town called Nennig, and all hell broke loose. The resistance was ferocious. The sharp, cracking report of their high-velocity tank guns was a sound unlike any we had heard in Brittany. A Tiger tank, a monstrous behemoth of steel, appeared at the end of a street, its 88mm cannon seeming to search for targets with a malevolent intelligence. The radio crackled to life. It was our battalion commander, Colonel Clute. His voice was strained but clear. L Company was cut off, surrounded. Captain Smith and his men were trapped. He needed me to get to them, to serve as a forward observer and call in artillery to break them out. I acknowledged the order and started up the high, snow-covered hill that separated me from L Company's last known position. The machine gun opened up as we neared the crest. My instrument corporal cried out and went down, his leg mangled. I screamed for the radio operator to get him back to the medics, to get him out of the kill zone. I pressed on alone, crawling through the snow, my M1 rifle feeling useless against a dug-in position. I pulled the pin on a grenade, scrambled forward and threw it with all my might into the nest. The explosion was followed by a blessed silence from that position. But it was a temporary reprieve. I thought that nest was the only enemy on the hill. In reality, I had stumbled into the heart of an entire armored division's defensive line. As I moved through the snow, their artillery found me, and the world exploded. When the chaos subsided, I was surrounded by those black boots, and my war for a time was over. They treated my wounds at a regimental aid station, a surprisingly professional and efficient operation. From there, they took me to the division headquarters. I was an officer, a West Point graduate, and they seemed to consider me a prize of sorts. The division's adjutant general, a full colonel, was a man who embodied the Prussian military ideal: stern, correct, and utterly professional. He didn't interrogate me. Instead, he placed me in a room under the guard of a master sergeant, a hulking, confident man who was in the middle of writing a letter to his girlfriend. The sergeant made it clear that I would be sleeping on the floor. The bed was his. We ended up talking for hours, a strange, surreal debate about who was winning the war. He was absolutely convinced of Germany's ultimate victory. I was just as certain of ours. The conversation escalated into a wager. I bet him 50,000 marks that the Allies would win. He laughed and took the bet, one I knew I would never be able to collect. My guard was confident to the point of being careless. 3 times I had to relieve myself, and each time he would just wave me toward the door, telling me to go ahead. The headquarters was in a large country house, surrounded by a vast, snow-covered field. The snow was 2 feet deep, but a path had been plowed to an outhouse. The 3rd time I went out, the cold night air hitting my face, I didn't turn towards the outhouse. I just kept walking, moving as quickly as I could across the open field, plunging into the deep snow, praying the darkness would hide me. I didn't get far before I heard the shouts. The master sergeant came screaming out of the house, raising the alarm. "Prisoner escape! Prisoner escape!" A whole company of German soldiers was turned out to search for me. I could hear their voices, see the beams of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I found a small stream, its water so cold it felt like fire, and submerged myself, hiding under the lip of the bank, my body shaking uncontrollably from the freezing temperature. I thought I would die of exposure right there. They searched for an hour, their voices coming closer and then receding. Finally, they gave up and were called back in. I waited, shivering in the dark, my hope beginning to rise. And then I heard him, a single soldier, trudging through the snow, coming right towards my hiding place. There's a sad sack in every unit, one man who never gets the word, and this was him. He walked right to the edge of the stream and jumped over, landing almost on top of me. He found me, of course. He dragged me out of the stream, and I was taken back to the headquarters, half frozen and defeated. The master sergeant was furious. He drew his pistol, a beautiful Luger with an ornate handle, and for a long moment I was certain he was going to shoot me. But before he could, the adjutant general's voice cut through the tension, ordering the sergeant to bring me to him. I stood dripping and shivering before the colonel's desk. He looked at me not with anger, but with a kind of detached curiosity. He knew the rules of the Geneva Convention, and he informed me that he knew I did too. From my serial number, they had identified me as a regular army officer. It was my duty to escape. He then told me something that stunned me into silence. He had just discussed my case with the division commander. The general, he said, sent his congratulations. I stood there speechless and then managed a "Thank you, sir." The colonel asked for my word that I would not try to escape again. I told him I could not give it. He nodded, understanding. "Okay," he said, "we've got to move you out at 2 o'clock in the morning." That was the last good treatment I received. In the dead of night, 2 guards escorted me out into the snow. We walked for miles, stopping at a lonely farmhouse. An old woman and her daughter lived there. As I stepped inside, the younger woman looked at me and spoke in German, her voice filled with a strange mix of hope and fear. Her husband, she said, was in America. She quickly realized I understood her, and a torrent of words followed. He had been with the Africa Corps, captured 4 years earlier, and was now in a prison camp in Mississippi. He had written to her, telling her what a great country America was, how well he was being treated, and that they would move there after the war. That night, I slept on the dirt floor of her house, and the old woman stayed up, periodically placing a small log on the fire to keep the chill away. It was a brief moment of shared humanity in the midst of madness. The next day, it was over. I was moved again, and my life became one of rough interrogations and gnawing hunger. My daily rations consisted of a single liter of thin soup and every few days 2 slices of bread. The Germans weren't eating much either. You just got used to it. I ended up in Oflag 3B, a prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg. It was a grim, depressing place, filled with men who were slowly wasting away. Hope was in short supply. Then one day, we heard the sound of engines and gunfire in the distance. A rumor swept through the camp like a wildfire. Patton was coming. He had sent a special armored task force to liberate us. It turned out the rumor was true, but tragically optimistic. The task force was too small, a daring but ultimately doomed raid. Only 1 tank made it through to our camp, and it punched a single ragged hole in the perimeter fence before being knocked out. The camp commandant, knowing a larger American force was surely on the way, fled with most of the guards. In the ensuing chaos, a handful of us saw our chance. General Patton's son-in-law, Colonel John Waters, was a prisoner in the camp hospital, having been wounded during the raid. He had been the objective of the mission. But for us, the objective was the hole in the fence. A group of 6 of us made a break for it. The journey was brutal. The 2 weakest men, unable to keep up, had to turn back and surrender themselves. 2 others were not so lucky. They were cut down by fire from the German forces that were now swarming the area, closing the net. That left just 2 of us. Along the way, we picked up a British corporal and another American PFC who had also escaped. The 4 of us, a small band of desperate men, pushed on. For 12 days, we moved through enemy territory. We traveled by night, hiding by day, our bodies weak from malnutrition. I had lost about 40 pounds in captivity, and every step was an effort of will. We stole food when we could, a raw potato from a field, a few eggs from a chicken coop. We were driven by a single, all-consuming desire to make it back to the American lines. On the 12th day, exhausted and on the verge of collapse, we stumbled into the small German town of Oberfell. The town seemed deserted, but we soon discovered it was being used to house about 40 French prisoners of war who were being used as laborers. We found 4 of them, and through a mix of broken French and German, I explained who we were. One of them, a charismatic man named Hubert, immediately saw the possibilities. The Frenchman went to the town's mayor, the Burgermeister, and informed him that I was the point of an imminent American attack and that the town was to surrender to me. The mayor, terrified, came out with a white flag. A sudden, intoxicating sense of power filled me. We were no longer escaping prisoners. We were a conquering army of 4. I ordered the mayor to have every weapon in the town brought to the square within the hour. What they brought was a pathetic collection of old blunderbusses and hunting rifles, some dating back to the 1800s. It didn't matter. I turned to Hubert. He was now the platoon leader of the Oberfell garrison. I ordered him to arm his men and post guards. Then my small command staff and I found the town's inn, the Rathaus, and went inside. We pooled the contents of our Red Cross parcels, which we had hoarded during our escape, and made a glorious milkshake from powdered milk, chocolate, and sugar. Then we went upstairs, fell into the first real beds we'd seen in months, and slept the sleep of the dead. The next morning, we were awakened by the sound of an American Jeep. A patrol from the 42nd Infantry Division had been led to the town by a Polish laborer we hadn't even known was there. He had slipped out at dawn, found them, and breathlessly told them, "Americans, Amerykański, in town." Our deliverance was at hand, but it came with a new complication. The American colonel in charge of the patrol took one look at us, gaunt, bearded, wearing ragged uniforms, and refused to believe our story. He was convinced we were Germans, specially trained to impersonate Americans. It was a reasonable suspicion, but infuriating. As he questioned me, I recognized him. He had been the regimental executive officer back when I was in training at Camp Robinson in Arkansas. I told him his name, Colonel Luongo, and reminded him of his post at the 66th Infantry Division. This only deepened his suspicion. He was impressed, he said, by how well the Germans had trained me. My phenomenal knowledge of the American order of battle wasn't helping. He asked where I went to school. The military academy, I told him. What class? 43. He stared at me for a long moment, then called over one of his junior officers. He said a single name, Douglas. It was a classmate of mine. The young lieutenant came over, looked at my bearded, emaciated face, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "Bud Bowling," he exclaimed. "What are you doing with that beard?" That broke the dam. Suddenly, I was no longer a suspected enemy agent, but a rescued hero. It was the beginning of another strange journey, back through the echelons of command, a dinner with the division commander, where I was waited on by an American PFC, who was terrified of being in the same room as a general, and finally a chance to get back in the war. The Geneva Convention stipulated that as an escaped prisoner of war, I was supposed to be sent out of the theater. But my war didn't feel over. I eventually made my way to the headquarters of the 21st Army Group, where the Chief of Staff, General David Barr, asked me if I wanted to go see my father. My dad was now a Major General, commanding the 84th Infantry Division. The thought of seeing him was complicated. We had always had a distant formal relationship, built on a foundation of mutual respect, but not much warmth. Still, he was my father, and I wanted to see him. I knew, however, that if I went to his headquarters, he wouldn't let me go home. And I was right. I found him near Hanover in a meeting with the Army commander, General Simpson. When General Simpson saw me, he smiled warmly. "Well, son," he said, "I suppose you'll be going home." Before I could answer, my dad looked at him, his expression unreadable, and said simply, "The war isn't over." And so the next day, I was assigned to my own father's division. He gave me a week to eat, to try and put some of the 40 pounds back on my frame. Then he said, I was going down to take a rifle company. I became the commanding officer of A Company, 334th Infantry Regiment. For the rest of the war, that company was my world. The only time I ever saw my dad was once a month when I drove to his headquarters in my Jeep to pick up the payroll. I'd stop in, say hello for 5 minutes, get the money, and go back to pay my troops. We got along great, as long as no one in the 84th Division thought I was getting any special treatment. I never did. My new command was my chance to apply all the brutal lessons I had learned. We pushed on, part of the final, massive drive into the heart of Germany. We fought our way across the plains, through ruined towns and desperate last-ditch resistance, until we finally reached our ultimate objective. We finished the war on the banks of the Elbe River, just 30 miles from the ruins of Berlin, looking across at the Russian soldiers on the other side. The war in Europe was over. We went into occupation duty, a strange period of limbo. The fighting was done, but we were still an army, still far from home. I was busy trying to keep my men occupied, running them through rifle ranges and drills, mostly to keep them out of trouble with the local girls. The talk was of Japan. We had all seen enough combat, but we were soldiers, and we accepted that we would likely see service in the Pacific. We knew what that meant. The Japanese fought with a fanaticism that promised a horrific, bloody invasion. We braced ourselves for at least 1 million American casualties. Then in August, the news came, spreading through the ranks via the Stars and Stripes newspaper. An atomic bomb had been dropped on a city called Hiroshima. We didn't understand the science, but we understood the implication. A few days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The reaction among the troops was not one of horror or moral debate. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. We knew that those 2 bombs had just saved our lives. Japan surrendered, and the world was finally at peace. For us, it meant we were going home. One day in November 1945, my first sergeant, a man named Bob Valency, who had been the vice president of Hershey's Chocolate Company in civilian life, came into my tent. He had a telegraphic order in his hand and a grin on his face. He'd been counting his service points, adding up his medals and time in combat, and was sure he'd be on the next boat home. He handed me the telegram. "Sir," he said, "you're going to beat me home. I thought you regular Army guys would never go home." The orders were simple and surreal. I was to report to the United States Military Academy at West Point to serve as a German language instructor. My journey had come full circle. I processed out at a replacement depot called Camp Lucky Strike, where they gave us lectures on how to be civilians again. When I finally found a major and explained I was on permanent change of station orders to West Point, not being discharged, he was apologetic. He had booted the ball with me, he said, and offered me a 14-day delay en route to make up for it. I took it. I went to Washington, and my fiancée, who had waited for me all this time, met me there. 2 weeks later, we were married in her hometown of Little Rock, Arkansas. In January of 1946, I stood in front of a classroom of cadets, ready to teach them the language of the enemy I had come to know so well, a world away from the snows of the Moselle and the wire fences of Hammelburg. The war was over, a new life was beginning.